I'm Joe Trotter, Energy, Environment, and Agriculture Task Force Director for ALEC, and we have John Sanders and Jason Hayes, who will introduce themselves in a sec. We're going to be talking about forestry, wildfires, Good Neighbor Authority. For those of you who were here or at our State and Nation Policy Summit and annual meeting last year, Good Neighbor Authority is a kind of an emerging concept in terms of wildfire prevention and forestry. We'll be talking a little bit about that and how that plays into making sure states don't burn down. But wildfires are a huge issue. The 2018 wildfires in California cost the U.S. economy close to $150 billion, not just in their state, but nearby states. Same wildfires produced a little under $8 billion in estimated health costs just in the Bay Area alone. Between 2021 and 2022, wildfires accounted for just tens of billions of dollars in damage across the United States. And so here at ALEC and amongst our partners and think tanks and industry, as well as our legislators, it's extremely important that we figure out what to do about it. And there's no full-blown prevention. It is just a part of the natural cycle and the natural order of things. But there is a lot we can do to help mitigate the risks and basically use our role as humanity to keep the environment in as good shape as possible. So, John, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Well, thank you so much, Joe. My name is John Sanders. I am director of the Center for Food, Power, and Life at the John Locke Foundation in North Carolina. This is a fairly new center. We started it last year, and its main focus is on agriculture, energy, and environmental issues at the state level.
And Jason?
Yeah, my name is Jason Hayes. I'm the Director of Energy and Environmental Policy at the Mackinac Center, which we noted previously is based in Midland, Michigan. And for this specific project, the paper that we're discussing, First in Forestry, I was able to take a trip down to North Carolina and work with John and Amy and Donald and the group at John Locke, and also talk to several North Carolina elected officials and members of the forest industry, and to just kind of discuss how national forests are being managed in North Carolina. And I was pleasantly surprised to find that North Carolina is actually doing quite a good job on their forest management compared to some of the other issues that you see in Western states. North Carolina is actually doing pretty well. So it was a good story to be able to tell.
Yeah, one of the interesting things about working on this issue, especially when I was on the federal side of things, is the Forest Service. It is a federal agency, but each region and each state has its own local offices, and they have a fair amount of autonomy to make decisions on what happens on these federal lands. So I was working on the West Virginia issue, and the Forest Service there was very much of, we have these big old trees, we can't harvest them. But meanwhile, the industry itself was just screaming from the rooftops saying, hey, we have these old trees, they're falling down, they're creating fire bridges, the forests aren't healthy, and we're not essentially doing anything about it. And forestry is and just lumber production, everything like that is considered one of the absolute cleanest industries, because they go ahead and plant trees for everyone they take, and they really strive to have less of an impact. And just sort of another fun fact is while the Western wildfires tend to get all of the press, and they tend to be extremely damaging, the southeast portion of the United States, in terms of numbers of wildfires, has significantly more than the ones out west. So I guess, do you guys want to introduce the report and talk a little bit about what you found, and then we can turn to some question and answer?
Really getting back. So Jason wrote this report for us. First in Forestry, North Carolina's forest management is a model for the nation. And it goes through North Carolina's history as either first in forestry or the cradle of forestry. I don't know if many of y'all are familiar with the Biltmore Estate in Asheville, but George Vanderbilt, who built the Biltmore Estate, when he took over the property, and he had 125,000 acres, if I remember correctly. In the late 19th century, he wanted some way of managing the forestry there as a private landowner, and he one of the things that he was dealing with was the problem of clear cutting on the land previously, and he's trying to restore it, and so he brings in a couple of Germans who are experienced in forestry, especially a gentleman named Schenck, who starts working with the local users, finds out that there are people there who like to use the property recreationally. So they work together on a plan to develop the land in a way that it is responsible for everyone involved, and stakeholders in the local area, as opposed to what is kind of taken over in environmental forest management, which is the idea of creating a pristine environment, which is to leave it alone completely. And that leads to a lot of what you just spoke of, the underbrush, the problem of dry timber and bridges, and that fire bridges, and also it harms the habitat for things like bobwhite quail, white-tailed deer, grouse, that need constant replenishing, and grassland that comes from a controlled burn. I see that Jason's back. I don't know if he would like to go more into it, if he's up and ready now.
If I'm running, yeah. As soon as I started speaking, I got a message on my iPad that said, "Your iPad's overheating. We're shutting down." So technology is great as long as it works. So I'm on plan 2 using my iPhone here. But yeah, what John was saying is accurate. North Carolina really was the kind of the genesis of scientific forestry in the United States. So he referred to Schenck and others like them, who developed the science of silviculture, which is using science to ensure that the forest you're dealing with grow in a certain at a certain rate. You bring back certain species. You can really target the setup that you want. And so that that idea persisted throughout much of the early 1900s, and then in the mid to late 1900s, we started to get into more of the ecological mindset, the deep ecology that John just spoke of, and that mindset that what we really should be doing is setting forests aside, preserving them instead of conserving them. And so the idea kind of became like basically putting a figurative fence around the forest and locking people out. So you stop doing activity, whether it's industrial or other, in the forested areas, and you just kind of preserve them from human impact. But what we've seen as a result of that is the wildfires that you talked about, Joe, at the start when you were introducing the idea. When you don't manage your forests except to put out fires immediately, then what happens is you get a buildup of ladder fuels, like the grass and the shrubs grow up, and a lot of smaller trees grow up. And where in the past you would either harvest those trees or go through and fires would go through and clear them out, then that fuel loading just builds and builds and builds. And when you actually do get a fire, it's extremely bad, because it's like we've all had, in a fireplace or when we're out camping, if you get the fire started, you put on a lot of wood and you get a huge big flame. That's exactly what happens in natural areas. When there's too much wood, too much fuel, it becomes a dangerous situation. So we recommend in the paper that you get out there and actively manage. And again, that is something that North Carolina is doing very well. Once you get that management schedule set up, then what you can do is return fire to the natural areas. And the Forest Service in North Carolina is very good at this. I still am getting emails one a week that says, we're doing a prescribed burn in one of the national forests in Croatoan or Yohari or wherever they're always doing burns, and so they're reducing that fuel load constantly. And then when a fire goes through, it stays green. The fire is very minimal. It doesn't do a lot of damage. It just clears out a lot of that extra fuel. So again, that's something that North Carolina is really setting a pattern that other areas could follow.
So to what extent is this a sort of a government management versus a private industry stepping in? What does that partnership look like? Because I don't think it's just government foresters going in there. It's also particular industries. Is there some sort of data on where it falls between those two sets of parties?
Yeah, and that's where the Good Neighbor Authority comes in, because Good Neighbor Authority allows state forest management agencies to partner with the federal agencies, and the state kind of acts as a liaison. So they actually bring in the private contractors to do most of this work. So you have private forest companies coming in and doing the spacing and the thinning and the brush clearing and the harvesting. And then under the terms of the Good Neighbor Authority agreements, or shared stewardship is the next version of it that's going on with the USDA and the U.S. Forest Service. The states get to keep some of that funding, and then also the private industry makes money doing the work. So that's really where Good Neighbor Authority has been extremely helpful, because a lot of the time the federal Forest Service does not have the staffing levels to be able to do that kind of work. So bringing in the private industry helps.
So another interesting thing, Todd Myers at our last meeting talked a bit about Good Neighbor Authority, and there was a slightly different part to it too. The ability for landowners adjacent to either state or federal lands to have sort of an ability to go in and help clean up, literally, if they were neighbors. Is that part of this too, or basically, yeah?
John, if you want to take a shot at it, that's fine. I don't I don't want to take all the time.
No, I'm comfortable with you taking most of the time on this. You're more the expert on that. I did some editing on the paper, but I learned a great deal from it. I would say that one of the things that really struck me, and just looking at your discussion of the recent forestry plan, is that it enables multiple uses of the forest. It involves everyone, and not just a distinct group, but it allows for harvesting, it allows for recreation, it allows for enjoying the wildlife and protecting the water in the wilderness. And it's got hunters and hikers and tribal interests and harvesters. They're all involved, and I think that is so welcome. And so I just thought it was really good to hear. As a North Carolinian, it made me happy.
Yeah, that's actually what the national forests were meant to do when they were first established. And Pisgah forest in North Carolina was one of the first that was purchased back in that time, the late 19th century, when they started setting up these forests. So they were supposed to be managed for multiple uses. So, like you said, a mix of hunting, outdoor recreation, timber management, even mineral and metal mining in some areas. And so, some of the critiques that I noticed were being published recently in North Carolina papers of the work that, like our report, and also what the Forest Service is doing. They tend to present this sort of multiple use management as like unrestrained industrial activity. And in the first place, no, that's not actually true, because basic economics would say that it does not pay for a forest company to go in and just cut everything, because that would only work for as long as they were cutting. Like it really would not allow them to target long-term effectiveness as a business. They would be shut down, because if they just go in and clear cut, and we actually wrote something about this, Shank was disturbed at some of the early logging that was done in the Pisgah area when they were initially setting the entire area up around on the Vanderbilt estate, and he looked at some of the prescribed logging that was done and said that they overdid it and they shouldn't have done that, and he would have preferred multiple entries over a long period of time. And so the critiques that we're hearing about this sort of multiple use management tend to critique that sort of thing, the mistakes that were made in the past. And so that scientific management now, you can look at it and say, yeah, actually, we do need multiple uses and multiple views. So whether it's native interests, whether it's mining companies, forest companies, outdoor recreation, all of that, even to the point of like people who are collecting mushrooms and that sort of thing. All of those people now are being added to the list of stakeholders that have an input into these kind of plans. And so it is a much broader, much more diverse discussion than it ever was before. And so, yeah, John's point is a good one, that it's good to see really everybody's invited in to take part. So like Joe, you were saying, the outdoor, or sorry, just adjacent private landowners, they have a say in it too, and they can be more comfortable that the land right beside their area is being managed properly. So if a fire starts, they don't have to worry that it's just going to come in and destroy their private property.
Yeah, Jason, what I thought was interesting, in response to the critics that you mentioned, who were worried about this outdated notion that there would just be clear cutting, the numbers that you brought in with the plan, they had a tier 1 and tier 2. The tier 1 was the more immediate, and then tier 2 would be the long-term management plan. But you, as quoting from your report, the numbers, the tier 1 timber cutting goal for the forest was basically 0.26%, 0.26% of the suitable area, and 0.1% of the total area of the entire forest.
Right.
In the first tier, and in the second tier, that number would increase, but the increase would not be that drastic and scary either. 0.7% of the total area. This is it per year, and 0.3% of the total area. 0.7% of the suitable area, 0.3% of the total area, and then over 15 years of the life of the plan, that would mean harvesting just 4.6% of the total area. So
Right.
any concerns about clear cutting is just not paying attention to the actual details of the plan.
Yes, absolutely. Because if you figure an average rotation, which is what you call, if you go in and you log an area, then you go back and log it again, that's called a rotation. And typically that's, depending on the species, between 75 to 150 years.
And so if you're logging 0.7% of the area, the total area, or sorry, the suitable area, then it would take far more than 100 years, 150 years to go through and log the entire forest. By the time you got anywhere near, I mean, you're talking several hundred years to thousands of years to go through and do all of this. It would long ago have regrown. And then, like we said before, because this is a multiple stakeholder collaborative planning set up, then people have an opportunity to go in and comment on this. They don't. It's not just, like it used to be in the olden days. Uh, Whoever was in charge in the government and one business person could go into a dark room, a dark smoke filled room, have a couple drinks, and decide how much they're going to do. That is not the way forest management planning happens anymore. It's a multi-year, multi-stakeholder process where the public has ample opportunity to be involved and to comment, and none of that old style management happens anymore.
That is one of the real successes of essentially modern forestry. There is a real public involvement. You've got commons, but you're not having the tragedy of the commons here.
Correct.
On not a scientific level, but on a personal level. I have an old tree farm out in West Virginia, backs up to some public land up the road. There you have the forestry concerns, you have conservation concerns, you have specific animals that they look to make sure there are habitable areas. You've got prescribed burns. It's just a mix of stakeholders, and the forest back there is absolutely pristine. That's state land in West Virginia, not federal, which is a bit of a different story in that state alone.
Mm-hmm.
It is to some extent different in every state, and it's one of the great things, and one of the less great things about this country is we're 50 different laboratories of democracy. And in the report, you talk about how much land is federal land versus state land versus private land, and it's kind of interesting to see what goes on in each of those states with how much is there. In places like Texas, where it's a little under 2% federal land, you're not seeing quite as much management from either the federal or necessarily the state level. But the flip side of that is you're going to have to do a lot of private forestry. It's just sort of an interesting look at how it's all going. And as I mentioned at the beginning, the Western wildfires tend to receive the thrust of the media coverage, and it's there's no denying it has a huge economic impact, and they tend to be out of control on a fairly regular basis.
Yes.
As somebody who works for ALEC, I've got to ask if there is something specific, maybe a couple of different recommendations that you think could be exported from North Carolina and the Carolinas and the surrounding areas to the Pacific Northwest and the West in general. What would you say to legislators out there would be essentially just an excellent first step in trying to tamp down on it all? Is there one or a couple of specific policy ideas?
Yeah, the big thing, and I've discussed this not only in the North Carolina paper, but I did another paper a few years ago cooperatively with Goldwater looking at Arizona's forests. And then I did one cooperatively with PERC, but we were looking at Michigan's forests. And in each one of these three papers, the things that we found is you reduce the conflict and move the Michigan paper we called conflict to cooperation. And you can do that by, the biggest thing is expecting that it's going to take time, because these things don't happen overnight. You don't change attitudes and beliefs about the different stakeholder groups overnight. It's a multi-year process. And then you have to have people that are committed to the process. So people have to sit down and they have to sit around a table and kind of hash out these details. So the biggest thing is you need the government agencies to be willing to put in that time, and then especially in when you're dealing with federal areas, you need to have that consistent support. So a lot of the time, federal budgeting situations can cause problems because budgets only last a year. So you have to find ways to make some of these projects go over decades, periods of decades. You have to get NEPA approval and all that sort of stuff. Um, it's difficult to get private business to sign on to this kind of thing where they have nothing more than a year's promise. So you have to make sure that the budgeting process is set up to allow these private partners to kind of extend the risk over multiple years so that they can actually pay these things down. And then you also have to realize that in a lot of cases, like you, Joe, were saying, there's big trees in the West, and the big trees are how you pay for a lot of this. When I looked at the situation in Arizona, a lot of the stuff that they were harvesting was really small, poor quality wood, ponderosa pine forests in northern Arizona, and you need to be willing to like the I guess the more green groups have to be willing to recognize that every once in a while you're going to have to throw in a bigger tree. So they had limited piece size, that's what it's called, to 16 inches diameter, and so those are pretty small trees when you're trying to pay for something like this. So if you're looking at it in terms of long-term viability of the forest, keeping the forest healthy, reducing forest fire, then taking a few of the bigger trees long term is better for the forest than shutting it all down and saying, no, we're not going to allow any of the bigger trees to go out. And then having a massive fire come through and literally sanitize the area. If you look at the Yellowstone fires in the late 80s, they were basically left with a moonscape in some of those areas, and they didn't start to reforest for as long as a decade or more after the fire went through. Whereas if you are willing to take a few big trees so that private industry can justify the expense of investing in the equipment and that sort of thing, then you can protect the forest and you don't have to worry about turning it into a moonscape because of a massive fire.
The environmental scientist in me is sort of always been stuck on the fact that bigger trees that have been around or fully mature, and from sort of just a carbon dioxide perspective, they don't actually pull as much carbon dioxide out of
Right.
the atmosphere as
Yep.
new growing smaller trees. And the federal government and some private industry groups somewhat recently did a study looking at how much mature forest there is in the United States. And one of the big fights is what exactly counts as a mature forest. If I remember correctly, it was about 18% of the forests were fully mature, which is just a nice way of saying they're not going to grow a whole heck of a lot more. And it also means that they're getting to a place where they're going to naturally reach the end of their lifespan, fall down, become fire bridges, become kindling, and all of that. And while they're great and majestic to look at, and really, I love large trees, but it's, it's fine to look at, but at that stage of their life, it's either the potential for destruction or sort of long-term degradation. Sort of at worst. At best, it can be used, cut down, harvested. I mean, again, from a more left-wing green perspective, if you go ahead and cut these trees down and then use them, turn it into wood. And these days, scientists have found ways to take wood and make it stronger to use in buildings, say on the West Coast, where it's flexible but won't snap during an earthquake, for example. It's once that wood is in a building or used in some sort of project, the carbon that again came from the atmosphere is sequestered. It's not being put back out there. So when it comes to talking to people who, when I talk large and mature forests, it's my argument with them is essentially you can look at it and it's great to look at, but beyond that, there are so many benefits to going ahead and, towards the end of their useful lives, turning them into something that benefits humanity, takes carbon out of the atmosphere. It's important to do things like that just to be good stewards of the environment. And wildfires have always been a natural thing. It's how forests have rejuvenated, reset the system. But with humanity so spread out and trying to prevent them, to prevent the economic damage and just all the cost that comes with them, it's extremely important that we are good stewards of these forests. So I do have a couple of questions for some folks.
Sure.
I know we've mostly been talking about the Southeast and the wildfires down there, but when you've been taking a look at what's been going on out west, what do you think the biggest takeaways, the biggest lessons that should be learned, not necessarily have been learned by these groups, but is it just sort of proper cleanup? Is it what are folks missing out there? That's the reason this keeps happening over and over and over.
Yeah, the biggest thing is it's a changing paradigm or a perspective, because it went from, like I said, in the 1800s, the early 1900s, there was a perspective that, you could just go in and you could log, and there would always be another drainage, or at the other side of the mountain, there's lots more. And then that switched, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, through into the early 2000s, that no, we need to preserve it, and old growth is the most important thing. And you'd hear stories about things like the spotted owl, and whenever you would see a West Coast group talking, it was they're going to go in and they're going to log the last remaining example of, and then stick in whatever tree species is in the area, western red cedar, or western hemlock, or something like that. And so it was that very preservationist mindset. And now it's starting to come back around because of issues like wildfire. When you start having hundreds of thousands of acres burn in a single fire, then even the most, we'll call it extreme, green groups are looking at that and going, okay, that's not healthy. And so the green groups are recognizing that what's happening out there is not an effective form of forest management. And so you can see there are like old school ecologists that were involved in some of the early, during the Clinton days, that were involved in getting clear cutting stopped on the West Coast, and that those ecologists now are coming back and writing articles and papers and saying, okay, this notion that the only healthy forest is an old growth forest, where you think of something like, the Sitka spruce or something like that on the coast of Vancouver Island in Canada, or the giant redwoods or that kind of thing. That only when you have those massive trees and old growth forest attributes, they're looking at it and going, okay, that stuff, like you said, Joe, that's nice. And it's park like, and it's what we imagine a park should always be. But they're also saying, and actually an important part of it is having small openings that are shrub species. It's called early cereal stages. So you go back to a small fire that takes it back to grasses and forbs. And then, over a period of a decade or two, you get shrubs coming in and small trees. And so it's a process. It's an ongoing, dynamic, changing system. And people are realizing that this idea of locking a forest up in a static and unchanging state of old growth is actually unhealthy, because no forest has ever existed that really is like that. You get small fires, you get disease and pest infestations come in. When trees get older, they're not able to fight off the bark beetles and that sort of thing. Or a fire comes through and the tree's not real healthy, so the fire does kill one or two, or that sort of thing. And then when some of those big trees die out, then there's an opening that appears, and so you get the shrubs and that coming back in. And from either a plant or an animal, the flora or fauna perspective, it's much healthier, much more diverse to have those, like the mixed kind of cereal stage. And so those ecologists and biologists are coming out and admitting that and writing that. And so they're more willing to take part in these discussions, the roundtable events and the stakeholder meetings. And so that's where you're starting to see some of the change. So that changing mindset is really what you need to look for.
Awesome. Another question that popped up. Actually, I don't know anything about this particular one. Have we seen forest fires happen more frequently on public land, or say privately owned land, or is there not really research into that?
Yeah, you get good examples of the Arizona paper. I discussed this. I'm sure Todd Myers would have discussed it when he was on previously. Some of the best examples of how to avoid the massive, like, stand-ending fires. You go and you look at the First Nations or the native bands, where they have done active management, because that's the way they always did it. They always used fire and that sort of thing. And because they have a different sort of tenure, they have an ability to do things on their land that maybe other, like, federal managers couldn't do. And so they're basically saying, you know what, we actually know what we're doing and we'll keep doing what we have always done. And so they use prescribed fire. They go in and they harvest and they clear out the shrubs and all that. And so when one of these fires goes through, then you can see very clearly that in the federal forests where it's not managed well, it's just burnt to a crisp. And then it's like somebody drew a line down a map. You can see where the native land starts, and it might be a little bit burnt where they had a light burn go through, but within a few weeks, certainly within a few months, it's greened right back up and it's healthy and it looks good. Whereas the federal land outside, especially in the western states, is just scarred for as much as a decade. It does not start growing back. So you can really see the difference on the different land tenures.
Well, I don't see any more questions right now, but I want to thank you both for being here and just plug the report. We'll make sure to include a link with the video when we put it out. It's excellent. It's a great read. And it's more than just an issue for the environmentalists and the conservationists. Wildfires and everything that goes into forest fires is something that's big for industries as well. I know when we talk with the transmission folks for electricity, it's a huge thing for them. It's a huge thing when it comes for infrastructure. And it's just one of those things that we have to manage as, humanity, and being good stewards of the land. So thank you both for being here, and thanks everyone for being on, and everyone who's watching this. Again, I'll put a link to the report out there, and thank you all for coming, and thank you for being on.